Well, thank you everybody for having me today. It's really fun to have an excuse to come down to Colorado Springs, up from Golden. Um, so my name's Estelle. The title of this talk is Addressing the Spiritual Crisis of Modern Society Through Online Spiritual Care. I hope you'll come away with something that's maybe a little different than what you typically focus on in a computer science program. I'm not going to have any numbers, or very few numbers on these slides. Mostly hoping to think about more socio-technical context, right? The things that are around us that affect how we use technology, and how can we design technologies intentionally to meet real human needs, right? So yes, this involves algorithms. Yes, this involves machine learning, but I'm not going to focus on any of that stuff because that's what you're already learning. You probably haven't. Let's actually, show of hands, who here has heard of spiritual care before? Okay, so that's a definite minority. Maybe 10, 20% of the room knows about that. I'm going to spend a good chunk of the talk just defining that for you, because a lot of people have not heard of it, even though it's one of the oldest forms of healthcare that is known in human society. So let's get started. If this thing it was working. The pointer works. Okay, well, it doesn't work. That's fine. So content warning up front, okay? This talk is going to involve sensitive issues and challenging life experiences related to mental illness, spiritual crisis, or death and dying. So if that's something that's going to be a problem, you may want to consider your choice to be here, or be ready that this is a sensitive topic that's coming up. Okay, so some sad face emoji. Who thinks the world is a happy place right now? We are experiencing epidemics of all kinds of illness, right? 2020 was terrible, right? COVID-19 was the thing that everybody was talking about. We have epidemics of mental illness. It's getting worse all the time. Probably about 20 to 50% of you in the room are experiencing mental health situation right now. I have dealt with this in my life quite a bit. It's very, very common in students and also more common in graduate programs. So you are not alone if you are in that boat. It is an epidemic. Plenty of other epidemics as well. Spiritual crisis doesn't actually get talked about, but it is just as prevalent in the population and potentially underlies some of the other types of mental illness that people might see, but is not being treated as such, which can kind of prolong the problem. So one of the approaches that technologists have taken to this are, hey, how can we throw technology at this problem? And I'll use examples from mental health because it's more studied and more well known before I get to spiritual care. So immediate support. Sonia's AI chatbot steps in for therapists. There's not enough mental health therapists in the world. You know what we should do? We should replace them with AI, right? Or offer them as a tool that can be used when a therapist isn't available or when people can't afford it. Okay. This is one strategy. Another strategy, end of life decisions predicted by AI. This article is talking about a lack of people that are working in palliative care contexts. Who here wants to talk about their final wishes and how they want their legacy to be light up and what's going to happen? Nobody wants to talk about that, right? We do not live in a culture that embraces talking about death or talking about dying before it's in your face. And so what happens is most people don't talk about it. And so most people will end up in a situation where they're at the hospital. Maybe they're in a coma and they're debating whether we're going to unplug them or not. Maybe they're going through their end of life care. Most people haven't talked about this. And so therefore, let's let AI predict what your last wishes would be. Okay. Who thinks that I feel like these are good ideas? Can you tell? Can you tell from my affect right now if I think this is a good idea? I think this is a terrible idea. But if you're looking at it from a business perspective or a raw numbers perspective, like, oh, yes, okay, get this person a chatbot because there's no therapist available. The actual solution, in my opinion, is let's train more therapists. Let's have insurance cover more therapists. Let's increase human connection in the world. Because another epidemic is isolation and loneliness. This is a rising problem in our world. It is a huge problem. People don't know how to talk to people anymore. And people saying that we're going to throw AI at it is I think, a very faulty premise, because then people only know how to talk to AI. And we're starting to see a lot of really, really, really concerning things happening as a result of this. Okay, I'm going to abandon this. For example, this was a year ago. This teenager was one of the first big news stories was reported to have been chatting with the character.ai chatbot. And I believe the story that time was that he thought the AI had a soul, and the AI was telling him that in order to be with him, he had to kill himself. And that was what he did. More recent case, Adam Rain. This was very recent. This was happening in April this year. And anybody who has looked into this news story, I've seen the transcripts of the chatbot. It's heinous. It's absolutely heinous. It's like, here's what I want to do. And the chatbot's like, oh, here, let me help you with that. Comes up with detailed stuff. Would you like to write a letter? Would you like to do this other stuff? There's no contesting the decision. This is what you want to do. Because the way that chatbots and AI are designed is to just basically affirm whatever the user wants, right? We don't deny user needs. We serve, we deliver, we do whatever the user says they want, right? Is that how your human relationships are? Do people push back on you? They do, because sometimes you're out of your mind. Or sometimes, the things that you think about yourself are not correct, right? And you need a human to kind of veer you back into reality space. So this is tragic. This is avoidable. This is happening increasingly. I picked out 2 stories that made big headlines. There are more examples of this. There's also cases of AI delusion. Who's heard of this, right? People just going absolutely off the rails, right? Like they might be married, they might be talking to their parents or something else, and they will get into a more intimate relationship with the chatbot and start believing, they'll believe that they're God, they'll break up with their relationship. There's all these things that people are doing as a result of AI, psychosis or illusion or whatever you want to call it, right? So this is happening increasingly frequently. So the one concept that I want you to leave with, which is something you're not going to usually think about in computer science, is a concept called unmaking. Human-computer interaction. I've heard that probably most of you are not familiar with this field, but what we do is we think about technical things, right? We use algorithms, we write code, but we're thinking more about the human end of that. How do people use technologies? How can we build technology so that it meets real human needs and serves societal good instead of potentially the opposite, right? And there's not that many people in HCI that are thinking about this unmaking concept, but I hope that number grows in the future, because there's been just this kind of reckless adoption of technology, and it has caused real problems in our world. Reckless adoption of AI, reckless adoption of social media, potentially, right? There's all kinds of technologies I could point to, but these are causing real problems in society, and they're driven by kind of a top-down tech bro culture, that's saying, here, this is what you need, right? Let's invest billions of dollars into this and keep it going. So I teach a class on human AI interaction right now, and this is a big topic in my class. But I won't get too far off track. So the opposite, unmaking is the opposite of making. We dismantle, decompose, or take things apart because they're causing problems, right? How do we do that? Really hard. Once something is already embedded in society, it's really hard to extract it. But I hope that you'll think about this as you move forward in your careers, because it actually exists alongside making. It's not to say we're never going to make things, right? But sometimes we have to think about taking things apart and putting them back together again in ways that are healthier. And I do believe in human progress. I believe it's possible. I don't think that anything is inevitable. That AI is talked about as inevitable. It's not, right? At least not the way that we're using it right now, right? It's critical of technological progress, right? There's this great quote that I cannot remember who said it, but not all speed is progress. Not all movement is progress. The fact that things are happening quickly doesn't mean it's good, right? And just calling it progress is potentially degenerative, right? Like it's not, it serves a certain marketing kind of agenda, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's good for society. So my provocation is that we can't inject AI to solve human problems, especially when it comes to spiritual needs. Okay, so what are those? We're going to move into the portion of the talk where I try to tell you about what spiritual care is. First thing that's critical here to understand is that religion and spirituality are not the same thing. Religion is a hierarchical system. We have an established authority, and that can look very different in different religions, but there's usually some kind of established leader of a church or a temple or a mosque or whatever the case is. And there's the way that you get power in this situation is by following rules and dogmas and things like that, and it trickles down from the original authority. Very rule-based system. Spirituality is a much more fluid concept, and it has to do with how do humans make sense of the world around them. What is my meaning and my purpose in my life? Sometimes people have a very high overlap between religion and spirituality, right? The reason that I have purpose in my life is because I'm serving what I believe to be a God, right? Sometimes people have spirituality with no religion, right? So I go out into nature, and for me, that is a deeply spiritual experience. In fact, I'm an atheist. I believe that there is no God, but for me, this is where my meaning and purpose comes from. Okay. Important distinction here. We're talking about spiritual care, not religious care, even though there is overlap. Okay. There's absolutely overlap. I acknowledge the overlap. And this doesn't get talked about a lot, right? If we're going by demographics, probably most people in this room are either religious or spiritual, and a handful of you are like stark atheists, right? Most of the population in the world is either religious or spiritual, mostly religious, actually. Then you kind of get the spiritual but not religious group, and then like the kind of minority are atheists and agnostics. So we kind of we tend to dismiss this a lot when we're in a scientific context because it's not science, right? It's just religion, it's metaphysical. Well, yes, the belief part of it is, right? Anything that's metaphysical that cannot be measured, fine, whatever. And in this talk, this is not related to my own personal religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs. I don't make any claims about the existence or non-existence of a God. It's actually immaterial because since most people on the planet experience themselves as a spiritual animal, they have spiritual needs. And those needs, especially in challenging crisis situations, become the most important thing to them. And if we ignore those critical, essential spiritual needs that people have, then we're not serving the whole human. Okay. So I told you this is one of the oldest fields that exists. And the reasons for that is because what spiritual needs are defined as things to do with meaning and purpose in life. Why am I here? Existential questions. Why am I here? What am I doing? Self-worth and belonging to community. Oftentimes, religious or spiritual communities are the most important communities in people's lives. Loving and being loved. We all need this. We need it. Right? We're humans. We need it. We have to have it. And it feels spiritual when it's real, right? And it feels kind of painful when it's not, right? So these are three fundamental spiritual needs. And when we're dealing with those three needs, spiritual care is very appropriate because it directly addresses those needs. I'm going to talk about the difference between mental health and spiritual care because there's some overlap, right? But they're also very distinct. And they're both needed. I'm not trying to say we don't need mental health care either. What I am trying to say is that this gets neglected all the time, whereas mental health care is increasingly being talked about now. So the approach is we try to fix, cure, or prevent problems, right? They're cognitive problems, they're behavioral problems, right? They're emotional problems. And we have certain interventions that we do this. There's all kinds of training and background that you get for this. You might be in psychiatry, neurology, psychology, or social work, right? Those are the types of fields that we would associate with mental health. And we have credentials like these, right? You don't just walk into an office and say, hey, can I have the credential, right? You have to go to school, you have to take tests, there's rigorous training that you take in order to get one of these credentials and to perform mental health care. Spiritual care, on the other hand, is completely non-prescriptive. We are not trying to fix a thing. You might be in absolute crisis, but we're not trying to fix you. We're trying to be with you. It's about accompaniment. It's about companionship. It's about making sure that people actually feel loved and connected while they're going through something. One of the most common cases where chaplaincy care gets talked about or spiritual care gets talked about is palliative care. People are dying. Can you fix that? No, you can't. We're all going to die. I'm sorry. If this is your first time learning that, I'd be very surprised. But we're all going to die. And we can't fix that, right? So it kind of comes to a point where, it's not about fixing things. It's about making sense of things. It's about finding purpose in what you're going through. And there's completely different training that people get to work in spiritual care. The idea is to actually directly address those basic spiritual needs, right? You wouldn't say it's the point of a therapist to love you. In fact, you'd probably be pretty freaked out if that was the purpose of going to a therapy appointment. A chaplain or a spiritual care provider actually is providing a loving presence, right? They're sitting with you. Sometimes they're totally silent. If you're in a room dying and you can't talk, they might just be sitting with you there so that you don't die alone. Okay. Palliative care is only one context. Chaplains also work in the military. They work in educational institutions. They work in hospitals. Hospitals are very frequent contexts. Homeless shelters, right? You can have a chaplain instated in any different context. They're always working around meaning and purpose when they're in any kind of situation. But there's accredited chaplaincy training programs. Sometimes people might get a MDiv, right? This is kind of officially a seminary thing. There's a lot of overlap between people who go to seminary and people who become chaplains, but the training for chaplaincy is very different. It's not about leading a congregation. It's about meeting a person exactly where they're at. And it's not religious, actually. So I might, for example, let's say that there was a Christian chaplain. They probably know a lot about the Christian faith. Actually, they're trained in all faiths, right? They have an interfaith training, and they can work with anyone, including atheists, including Muslims, including Jewish people, right? They are trained in all kinds of rituals of all kinds of different religions. But the point is to say, where is this person? What do they believe? What is it in their own world that gives them purpose and meaning? And how do we help them connect to that when they're going through a crisis? Okay. The most common title is board certified chaplain, right? They also might have titles like spiritual counselors, spiritual directors. Sometimes nurses will do spiritual care as well, in kind of a less rigorous or like a less, they're more of a generalist, right? Chaplains are considered specialists. A nurse or a doctor might be considered a generalist, as long as they're being kind of caring and loving and using some of the tools of the trade. Mental health typically uses these types of psychological assessment tools. You've probably all seen this. This is the PHQ-9. It's a measure of depression, quantitative thing. These are mental health symptoms, right? How much are these mental health symptoms affecting you? Spiritual care assessments look really different, right? It's actually a conversational tool, right? What's your belief? Is it important to you? Are you part of a community? How would you like me to address these issues as they pertain to your healthcare? If you have spiritual or religious beliefs, almost certainly that affects the way you're making decisions. Almost certainly that affects the types of treatments you might choose, right? In some religions, certain treatments might be completely off limits, right? You might not be allowed to do certain things, right? Or there might be certain ways that the clinicians can be working with you that's more respectful of your beliefs, right? And so this is an example. There's a bunch of other tools this is one example that kind of just shows the difference between mental health and spiritual care. So there is some overlap, right? These things in the middle, compassionate listening, thoughtful question asking, emotional validation, even the role of religion or spirituality in managing health. This is not to say that your therapist is never going to talk about your religious or your spiritual beliefs, right? You might talk about those things with your therapist, but they're probably not a priest, right? They probably don't have deep seminary training, and they probably aren't deeply qualified to do things like rituals, right? It's a very different type of a way of thinking about RS. The standard things that we would think of as mental health are medication, cognitive or dialectical behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing. All of these things are intended to change something, to fix symptoms, right? And once you get to a place of stability, you're like, great, I'm done, right? Maybe I just keep taking this medication and it kind of solves my problem and I'm fine, right? Great. These things are pretty different. Silent, loving presence. Like I said before, maybe the chaplain's just sitting in the room and putting a hand on your shoulder as you're going through pre-op or death or whatever the situation is. Helping to go deeper into one's own beliefs or crises. It is not about converting people. That's a common misconception in the general public. Providing space to adapt beliefs. Actually, this is really, really important. An example I like to give about this is that there's a lot of people, and this is not to attack anyone's beliefs, first of all, disclaimer. I've just learned this from chaplains, is that a lot of people will suffer because in their religion, oh, the reason that you got sick is because God is punishing you for your sin. That's a painful thing to believe. That's a really, really, really painful thing to believe. You might have not done anything wrong, and here you are having an existential crisis because you believe that you're being punished for a sin you didn't know you committed. So chaplains might work with someone to be like, well, what do you think about that? And trying to let them release a belief that is causing real despair. And if you don't address that belief, good luck with the mental health, good luck with medication, right? There could easily be an underlying spiritual issue that is causing a mental health symptom. And if you don't address the underlying spiritual issue, you're gonna have a hard time having that person actually let go of anything. They can also do rituals if they are requested, and they very frequently are, right? So things like baptism, or prayer, or dying rites, things like that. Rituals that are very, very meaningful to people when they're going through these big moments in their life. Blessings, prayers, etc. Right? So hopefully that gives you a sense of the difference between these two professions. Why should technology designers think about spiritual care? Right? This has been an interesting journey for me. When I started my PhD, I didn't know what spiritual care was. I had no intention of looking into this. Maybe I won't go into the story about the personal story that got me into this, but I'll tell you the research story about how I got into this. So this hasn't been looked at. And in fact, the professional discipline of spiritual care, up until 2020, said, you know what, we reject technology. Technology can be everywhere else, but it's not for our field because there's so much about our presence and the way it feels to be in a room with someone who's loving you. You can't use technology to replace that. There's no place for technology in any of this. So they actively rejected it as a field. And then 2020 happened. And they were like, oh, we can't have that position anymore. Because if we have that position, then we are systematically denying care to everyone. Right? So telechaplaincy has been sort of on the rise, right? There's more people that are willing to accept that I can have a phone call or I can meet on Zoom with a chaplain, and that's an acceptable alternative. And my research kind of gets into online communities, right? There's been lots of research that looks at mental health and the way that people turn to online communities to deal with their mental health issues. My lab is the first research lab that's ever looking at this possibility for spiritual care specifically. How did I get there? Well, here we go. The first, or not the first part of the talk, I guess the first part of the talk was intro. But I'm going to talk about CaringBridge, which is a nonprofit. I still talk to them. I still collaborate with them. It's a nonprofit health platform that I'll show on the next slide. People are already using technology for spiritual care. Who here has ever seen a sensitive disclosure about health on social media? Really? Come on, more that. See, usually it's almost everyone will raise their hand with that question because it's like you're on Facebook and someone's like, oh my gosh, I'm going in for surgery, or I just got diagnosed with this thing, right? And then those Facebook posts, those tweets, those whatever, tend to get a lot of activity, right? What's the most common comment? I'm praying for you. I'm praying for you. Thoughts and prayers. That's a double-edged sword because that term also kind of gets used with school shootings, and it's people will criticize it for being it's just meaningless fluff, right? But for actually a huge proportion of the population, sending prayers is a very meaningful activity that they can do, and receiving prayers is equally meaningful for a lot of people, not everyone. So I'll talk about CaringBridge, and then I'll talk about Reddit in the second part, which is where I'm currently focusing a lot of my energy. We deeply need more spiritual care to be able to address societal crises, and technology is our only hope for doing this at scale. Okay. Okay, so CaringBridge, it's a health blogging platform. Patients and caregivers can write a journal. Friends and family can subscribe to the journal. And there's some special privacy features. It's a nonprofit. They don't sell ads. They don't sell your data, right? Which is actually a really big deal if you have an illness that you don't want people to find out about. It also lets you protect your site. So you don't have to let anyone on the internet look at it, right? Only people that you allow. If that's a set, you can choose a setting where it's only people that you invite. You can choose a setting where it's only people that have a registered CaringBridge profile, so I can see who all has been here, right? And I know who's been to my site, which when we're dealing with these life-threatening illnesses, it becomes very important to you. They have about 40 million unique site visits annually. So it's not a huge site. It's nowhere near as big as the big, huge social media players, but this is not a small number of people. They actively have about 25,000 caregivers and patients who are actively maintaining journals, right? So it's a relatively small nonprofit, but I can tell you from working with them since 2015 that When people start one of these CaringBridge journals and take it seriously, it becomes absolutely central to it, to the way that they manage information and share things out, right? The alternative is that you have text message chains. It's like, okay, you tell you, you tell you, you tell you, and you get these kind of crazy, like something happened. Like I had to go in for chemo, and I want everybody in my network to know about it, but how does that information get out, right? It's really hard to manage health information, especially when you're suffering, right? So this puts it in a central location, and it's like, oh, how are you doing? Just go look at my CaringBridge page. It makes it way easier for people. So if you know someone who is in a situation like this, CaringBridge is a great tool. It's a really powerful tool. And so one of the early studies I did, this one was published in 2020, was to look at expressions of appreciation in CaringBridge journals. So this was a text-based study. It's quantitative, right? It's a numerical measure of like what kind of matters to people. It's things like, oh, thank you so much for all of the X, Y, Z that you did for me. This is the people who are writing the CaringBridge site saying this out to their network. And the reason this was interesting is because it's a proxy for the types of support that CaringBridge can mediate for people, right? It gives me a measure of what matters to people on CaringBridge. So you can't read these things, but this one is prayer. This green bar is prayer. This bar is emotional expressions of emotional support. Like, thank you so much for all your kind words, right? Help me feel better. This is informational support. So things like information about the disease. Informational support is massive on other platforms, right? If you're thinking about, like, if you go to a subreddit, who uses Reddit in here? Okay, so most of the room, right? Or you at least know what it is, right? You might go to a subreddit for cancer, right? And then it's almost all about information, right? It's about how do I get treatment for this, or what are the symptoms and side effects of this? How should I navigate this disease? CaringBridge is not about informational support, even though other online communities are. Okay, and these are all different types of instrumental support, material support, food, practical items, chores, transportation, etc. The things that people need when they're going through a health crisis. So prayer wins out by frequency significantly. It's the most commonly thing. Thank you so much for all your prayers. I could feel them, right? And then what's even more interesting to me than the prevalence of prayer in the text is this is a subjective measure, right? This was a survey that I did, and I told people, here's the kinds of things that you write about in your journals. Information, co-located emotional support, remote emotional support, instrumental support, and prayer. How important is this to you? That was the question. How important is prayer to you? How important is instrumental support to you? And prayer wins. It's the most important thing that, according to users, this is over 1,000 people took this survey. Prayer, good vibes, kind of these energetic karma things, that is the most important thing to people. This is empirical data, right? Notice that this has nothing to do with whether or not God exists, right? This is human experience. And look at the shape of this thing. This is like, right? These ones are a little bit more, a little bit more normal. And then this one is just like, like it has a different shape than the other distributions, right? So this was the first piece of data that I got that I was like, whoa, what is going on here, right? I'm actually not religious, okay? Personally, I'm not religious. So for me looking at this as a scientist, I'm like, okay, this clearly matters to people. Like, I need to follow this, right? So in a subsequent study, what I did was I worked with a bunch of different stakeholders to come up with the definition of spiritual support. What is spiritual support? Clearly, prayer is very important to you, but prayer is only one kind of spiritual thing. Let's come up with a broader definition. And what I found in that study was that the way that people think about it is that spirituality is underlying everything else that they do. If I'm bringing you a lasagna, it's not because I intrinsically care about the lasagna. It's because I love you. And I want to show that to you somehow. So I'm going to make this lasagna and I'm going to infuse it with love and I'm going to drop it off at your door because I know that you're hurting right now. It's actually a spiritual activity for people. It underlies the other types of help that they choose to give. And it also shapes the type of help that they choose to give. So prayer, obviously a spiritual activity. If I'm Christian, it might be Christian prayers, right? If I'm any other faith, it might be the prayers of that faith. If it's a lasagna, it better be a vegetarian lasagna if we're dealing with someone who's Muslim and doesn't eat pork, right? It makes a big difference in the way that the care is shaped, right? So it's an underlying dimension of other forms of care. And actually revising this definition now based on some recent work. We just submitted a paper on this that I hope gets accepted. Chaplains and spiritual care providers were like, yeah, you know what? Support sounds a little bit transactional. We like the word care better. Let's update the definition to be care. And it's all about relational accompaniment more than it is about giving somebody something, right? So if you're in a spiritual care interaction, it's actually beneficial and nourishing mutually for both people that are in the interaction, whether or not you're the one dying or I'm the one dying, right? And there's also this element of tending to the inner spirit that was kind of missing from our original definition. So I've since worked on some interface issues for visualizing prayer, and I won't get into that because there's other things I want to tell you about. But I've been following this now, and I made my entire faculty job search and my research lab and everything has been all about spiritual care because no one else is doing this. And now that I know what it is and I understand what spiritual care is, I'm like, this is what we are missing. People don't know how to love each other anymore. People don't know how to just sit and be present. They fidget, they go on social media. When was the last time you felt like someone was being deeply, deeply present with you? It's something that's missing in a lot of our lives. So CaringBridge facilitates online spiritual care. I showed this through my methods. And I'll call it a prayer engine sometimes, right? It's a prayer engine, and that's why people love it. That's why it's important to them, because it helps them feel this kind of spiritual connection. But the problem is that CaringBridge is used by people who already have community. People to subscribe to their journal. People are isolated in today's world. And so people end up on Reddit, going to the lonely subreddit, or the PTSD subreddit, or the schizophrenia subreddit, so that they can talk about issues that are really stigmatized. And it sometimes is the only form of socialization that they have, are these online communities. So I've started looking at Reddit now. So every topic under the sun, people have anonymous profiles, which has been studied a lot. People can be more honest and open about sensitive issues when they're anonymous, right? So this does happen. The problem is that bad stuff comes with anonymity as well, right? You can be more abusive and there's no consequences, right? So this is really, really a touchy topic. There's a whole body of work in human-computer interaction about online governance. How do we moderate these spaces? How do we deal with the fact that people are coming here and doing these really meaningful activities, but that it's equally inviting to trolls and abusers, right? Doxers, all these terrible things that can happen in online communities. But there's 70 million unique daily users, so this is a much larger platform than CaringBridge. So this is a paper that I had accepted. I'm going to go to Bergen and present it in October, so I'm very excited about that. Just a couple weeks from now. I've got 5 other papers in the works too, but I'm mostly going to focus on this one because it's already been accepted. So many thanks to all the people's names there that you see who have contributed to this work. So here's Lonely, right? This is a huge subreddit. There's 400,000 people on this subreddit. You can see things like a community description. This is what it's about. It's for all the lonely people. Okay, that's a little bit of a joke, but that's fine. Everyone is welcome here, no matter your age, race, sexuality, etc. Right? Please be accepting of people and be kind. There's rules, right? We're supposed to follow these rules. Do these rules always get followed? Absolutely not, right? But they're stated, right? These are things in the interface that are supposed to help norm the community and make it an effective place. Right? So there's 400,000 people. These are the kinds of posts that people make, right? It's anything that has to do with being lonely is a post that gets put here. And it's dangerous. This is dangerous, right? Reminder, don't put your social medias or phone numbers on this subreddit. So come here, try to scratch the itch for socializing a little bit, but be careful, please, because there's predators, right? That's real. This is one example of a subreddit. But there's lots of subreddits. So the ones that I've looked at are things like cancer, hospice, suicide watch. This is a very, it's 500,000 people, right? This is a very, very difficult subreddit. People are coming and they are posting things, and they're posting their plans. They're saying, I'm about to do it. And then people heap on and they're like, please don't do it. You're loved, whatever, right? But it's a last ditch thing. And it's very, very, it's very difficult subreddit. What do we do with this? How do we help these people? Right? This is the question, right? They're coming here because they're desperate. How do we help them when they get here? The methods that we used in this study was we talked to 22 professional chaplains and spiritual care providers. So they had all these different titles. They were all well educated. Most of them had 10 plus years of experience, right? So they're very, very experienced people. They're located all across the USA. Most of them have never seen Reddit before. And they're very diverse in terms of their background, their religious background. Like I said before, they're trained to work with anybody, right? So keep that in mind. But even from their personal background, quite diverse. We intentionally sought diverse people because we want to make sure that our results are applicable to everyone. And we did semi-structured interviews where we asked about in the clinical setting, what do you do every day, right? How does your work look? What do you use? What kind of technology are you using in your clinic? And how are your patients using social media, right? Do you know anything about that, right? So we started off with interviews. As a computer scientist, who's ever thought of interviews as a computer science method? A couple of you. Okay. In human-computer interaction, interviews is a very, very common method. It's one of the best ways that we find out how technology affects people. We talk to them. And we use qualitative analysis to go through that. We also did user testing sessions. This might feel a little bit more computer science-y to you guys, right? But we sit a user down in front of a screen and we say, okay, here's a technology, use it, and talk about it while you're using it. So we brought them to Reddit and we told them what it was, because most of them didn't even know what it was. Choose one or two subreddit forums that are based on an illness condition. What's going on in these subreddits? Is this good? Is this helpful? Right? Is this nourishing? How could we make it better? What is needed in this space to actually provide helpful care to these people who are in deep despair and suffering? We also had them compose a response to an existing post. We didn't submit it just to avoid interfering, right, with our methods. How am I doing on time? I should probably be checking that. Let me just tack really quick. 3:42. Okay, great. So we didn't have them post anything because we didn't want to interfere with the communities. We probably should have posted things because the stuff that they wrote was amazing, right? But this is one of those kind of tension things where it's like, we don't want to impact the communities that we're trying to observe, at least not until we have IRB to do that. So here's an example of one of the posts. This was on the PTSD subreddit. How do you handle a traumaversary, right? Okay, I'm about to have a traumatic, I know that this is going to be hard for me. I've got an anniversary coming up of my trauma. And then we have the chaplains kind of composing some responses that we didn't submit. We categorized what we thought, which technique from chaplaincy we thought that they were based on an established taxonomy of chaplaincy care techniques, and we reported all that stuff in the paper. But this is what the method looked like during the user session. So what were the results, right? Well, really, we didn't know what anyone was going to think about this because chaplains don't go online, really. They haven't thought about online communities. And the field has historically rejected technology. So it's like, we didn't know what was going to happen. They were actually quite positive towards the possibility of using this for spiritual care. They recognized that we need better technology outside of the clinic. Why? Because people spend most of their time outside of the clinic. You're not always going to have your spiritual crisis when you're in your hospital bed. And to give people better access to this when they're not in the hospital setting, they recognize that was something that was necessary. It's eye-opening for them to witness these online disclosures. They could not believe it. How are people just disclosing this deep, dark despair to anyone on the internet? How are they doing that? It kind of blew their minds because they're so used to these one-on-one interactions and these very special, curated kind of context, right? That this just blew their mind that people were doing this in online spaces. And they were perceived as accessible and scalable. There's not enough chaplains in the world to serve the need. There's not enough mental health therapists to serve the need. There's not enough physicians to serve the need, right? There's just not enough healthcare providers in general. And they recognize that actually, if we can get people interacting in these spaces, it makes it more accessible and it makes my work as a chaplain potentially access more people. So the kind of conclusion we came to here is that chaplaincy care can meet patients where they're at. Okay. In the same sense I was talking earlier about when I'm not a chaplain, but if I were, and I was coming up to a patient, it's not about me imposing anything on them. It's about figuring out, where are you? how are you doing, right? What is going on with you at your deepest levels, your most profound, your meaning making systems? Like, what is going on with you? How do we access that and tap into that? Meeting them where they're at. Well, people are coming to the internet with those types of crises, actually more than they're asking for a chaplain. Most of you didn't even know what spiritual care was, so you wouldn't even know to ask for one in a hospital setting, right? So if chaplains were to enter these types of online spaces, then they could meet people where they're at in more ways than one. Thousands of people are here online. This is a direct quote from participant 8, saying, hey, I need support, but my pastor friends are sitting in empty desks. This is another trend in the Western world right now, is that people are turning away from religion. There's people are not going to church as often. If we're talking about the United States is majority Christian. People might still identify as Christian, but they're not going to church as often. The communities are starting to degrade. And pastors are sitting at empty desks. They're not getting the same kind of traffic that they used to get. But they're going online. They'd rather talk to strangers online than they would go talk to a pastor. Similar to what's been known as street ministry, right? So in chaplaincy care, it's kind of like just hitting the streets and like trying to find out who needs help, right? This could be a future opportunity in spiritual care, a Reddit ministry, a Reddit chaplain, right? Get these people who have the skills to address spiritual crises and needs and get them into the spaces where people are suffering, right? They're online. Go to them, right? But there's no training that exists currently in chaplaincy. I'm giving talks about this in October, actually, at a conference where a bunch of spiritual care providers go. We need to develop trainings, right? They know how to deal with people in person. They don't know how to deal with these large online communities. We need better trainings that are going to be able to give them the skills to interact effectively in those spaces. But there's support for it in general, which is the first thing to establish, right? With stakeholder research. Another thing I'll say, since most of you aren't HCI people, stakeholder buy-in, right? When we're trying to design technologies effectively, we have to work with our stakeholders and consider what they care about and to build the technology the way that they're kind of telling us needs to be built. Otherwise, they'll reject it. They won't use it. Okay, so getting stakeholder buy-in is essential if you want to do really good technology design. And this is the first study that really established stakeholder buy-in on this concept of online spiritual care communities. So these spaces aren't ready for clinical participation, right? This is another thing. All of our participants were like, you know what? This is cool that people are doing this, but this is not clinical care. This is dangerous. Some of the comments are like well-intentioned, but people don't know how to provide helpful, supportive comments that are going to be useful. Some people are giving bad advice. Some people are abusing you. It all might happen in the same thread. They're never going to say at this moment in time, hey, you're struggling with suicidal thoughts, go on to Suicide Watch. No one is going to say that, right? Because the spaces haven't been designed yet to be sufficiently safe or sufficiently trustworthy. So there's promise in the model. There's a lot of promise in the model. Chaplains support this, but they're not ready yet. What's it going to take to get there? We call this is the kind of the big piece there, the summary of the paper. We call this the care loop model. And this is based on chaplains' perspectives. We're not institutional-based care. Traditional care is not going anywhere. We still need it. We still need in person. We still need the chaplain to be sitting there with their hand on your shoulder while you're dying. We're not trying to get rid of that, right? That is absolutely vital. And it is part of a whole human-centered approach, right? Clinical care it's recommended to have chaplains available so that we can tend to the whole human. Not all hospitals do, but a lot of them do. We would say that this is a complementary form of care, platform-based community care that addresses the limitations of institutional care. It's available all the time. It's free. You can use this when you're out of the hospital, but it's really important that we have these mutual referral loops. So if I'm really, really in a crisis, maybe I can get like a Band-Aid by talking to people here, but we have to get referred to professional care to make sure that the issue actually gets dealt with. And if we're in the institutional care setting, we want to make sure people have continuous care. So recommend them to these spaces, as long as these spaces are safe and well-designed and run by organizations that we trust, right? Not Reddit, almost certainly not Reddit. Okay, Reddit was a site for ideation. We weren't trying to say, let's make this happen on Reddit. But it's interesting to think about how might we make it happen on Reddit. Chaplains, they talked about themselves as potentially being moderators of these subreddits or subreddit-like things. Like they could moderate the community and help to establish what the rules and norms are. They could model good care skills and norms for other users. Because when you see that when the person in charge is acting in a certain way, others model that behavior. They learn it from the person in charge. That's actually a really important foundational thing that happens in online communities. For lay users, we need training. Right? You need to have a little bit of a sense of like what's appropriate here, right? And online communities don't typically do this. You just show up and start interacting. We want to actually add design friction and force people to go through some kind of a basic training before they're allowed to provide care. And the UI UX could be improved in many ways to facilitate this better. For example, they were having a really big problem with multi-threaded discussion threads, right? Because you get nested. People just start piling on, right? And you might get thousands of comments or you might get zero, right? Both are equally problematic because you don't know what to focus on. What's the good stuff, right? Like I need like 3 people that actually know what they're doing to like have a conversation with me. I don't need thousands of people because it actually gets distracting and harder to meet the need when there's that much going on. So slow things down and reflect. How can we make technology move slower instead of faster? That's not the conventional computer science way, is it, right? They thought that there were many benefits of this. So increased patient agency in initiating care. Oftentimes, if you're at a hospital situation, the chaplain's just walking around the floor and like popping their head in and being like, can I have a talk with you sort of situation. You might get referred to a chaplain if you're visibly expressing signs of distress. But it's not that frequently that a patient says, hey, can I see a chaplain? Whereas if they had this online kind of community thing, it'd be more like people volunteering, like, I need help. They get more agency in initiating care, which means that they're more open to it, potentially. Greater public consciousness of what is spiritual care. If there was a big, huge subreddit for spiritual care, people might know what it is more. And we can serve more people in need. So there's lots of research ahead that is needed in order to be able to realize these things for things like efficacy and safety, trust and credibility. How do we pragmatically make this possible? How do we pay people to work in these spaces, right? You can't just have professional chaplains showing up and not pay them to do this. This is a job. This is care work. And we have to figure out ways to make that financially viable. How do we affiliate our communities with organizations? Should it be with a hospital? Should it be with, the Front Range area? Should it be Texas? Like, should it be the world, right? These are really interesting questions, and I have some research on that because I've done some follow-up work that isn't in this talk yet, but that's okay. I'm just going to end up on this slide again. I already showed you this slide, but I want to come back to it because if you walk out of here with nothing else today, hopefully you know more about what is spiritual care. First of all, it exists, it's a thing, it's really valuable and might be relevant to people you know in your life. But we also can't just throw technology at stuff and figure that it's going to solve the problem, right? We are doing this irresponsibly. Not we as in people in this room, but as a human race right now, what we are doing is irresponsible. We are throwing AI at everything. And I contend that is making things worse, not better. And that the better solutions are going to be how do we use technology to connect people? How do we use technology to help people become skillful in social interaction, in loving each other, in holding space, in being present? Right? We can do that. We can choose to do that instead of saying, here's an AI chatbot, right? It's actually harder to do it that way. The AI chatbot is the easy solution. What I'm talking about is actually harder, but that makes it, I think, better in the long run. So that's it. That's all I have for you today. Thank you to the John Templeton Foundation for funding this work. And I am happy to take any questions.
I guess maybe this is too open-ended, but how do we start the process of unmaking that you're talking about, given that the folks that have all of the technological capital are perhaps so in need of spiritual care that they don't even realize that they are.
Yeah. So some of you may or may not know this, but there's a very small group of very rich men that are running the show right now. And for this small group of very rich men, they do have a religion. The religion is AI. And there are literally like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, go look this up, right? They actually believe that AI is the highest form of consciousness that will exist on this planet, and that humans are getting in the way. And everything we do to slow down AI is getting in the way of God, essentially. Okay, so that's the religion of these guys. And they do say that publicly in interviews and things like that. That's not the way that they're marketing their companies, obviously. But I think that there are several things that are needed. First of all, is greater awareness, right? The second that we all start becoming more aware of what it is that's actually driving these trends, the less we're hyped up about it, and the less we're like, get on board, get on board, get on board, get on board. Like, I can't tell you how many students come to my office being like, oh, I want to learn about AI. And I'm like, well, why? Because that's the only thing the jobs are going to be, all the jobs are going to be AI. Okay, take a breath. Yes, it's a thing right now. It's a really big thing, and I'm not trying to say that it's not important. But I think that there are ways to get more creative about how you organize your own career, to get more resolve in your personal values. This is what I teach in my classes. Like, I'm teaching an AI, human AI interaction and AI ethics class. And the first thing that I talk about is like, what are your values? Do you know what your values are that are driving you to make decisions in the world? If your value is get a job, make money, you might be able to do that just fine. Are you going to be happy? Are you going to be fulfilled under that model? I had a career in industry before I came back. And it was like in creative writing and marketing and stuff, but it wasn't even related to computer science. And I learned that my values did not align. And I saw all these people that had been there for 10, 20 years, they were dead inside. And I was like, I don't want to become that. So I figured out what my values were, and I was like, I'm quitting this place and I'm going to go do something better, right? The second that you get clarity on the values, the second you have a roadmap. Because you know what you stand for, and you pursue only the things that are in alignment with that. And you refuse to say yes to anything that doesn't align with your values. Because if all the smart people in the world did that, instead of caving and just being like, oh, this is the best opportunity because it makes the most money, right? We would be in a very different situation. So that's my first answer to this, is figure out what are the dominant values that are driving this. Do you agree with them? If you don't agree with them, figure out what yours are and just die hard, like be true to that, because you can create opportunities, find opportunities, or attract opportunities that line up with those values. You do not have to sell out. Okay, that's my first thing to especially all the students in the room. The second thing that I would say is that there are, what I have found is that looking only at opportunities that exist limits the scope, right? If you start to think about, how do I create something new in the world, and you find out ways to be creative and drive that change, yeah, sure, that might be entrepreneurship, right? That might be the case, something we're talking about in our department all the time. It's like, okay, people don't need intro level coders anymore, right? Those jobs are going away. Not entirely, right? But AI can handle it, right? So how do you use your computer science thinking to kind of like, maybe you don't work as a coder, maybe you work in some other capacity and use your computational skills to support this other capacity, right? Think more creatively about what you're going to be in the world. I could probably go on with other answers, but that's my, like, get clear on your values, like, today, because the world needs you. Anybody else? Go ahead.
Yeah. So I guess the question, maybe it's, so your main question is, you said probably not ready.
Yeah.
But as who asked, bank robbers, or why you bank rob banks, is because that's where the money is.
Yeah.
Right. Reddit is where a lot of people
Yeah.
Where they go for help.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I understand the whole problematic.
Oh yeah.
Totally, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
But if you try to create a new platform,
yes,
don't get enough people to go to that
this
platform,
is, yes,
then
Yes.
may be a superior platform, but it might
Yep.
not be.
Okay, so what you are hitting on is a quintessential HCI problem.
Yeah.
We have what's called the cold start problem. Who's ever heard of this before? Raise your hand. Cold start problem. Okay, so anytime that you are trying to do anything new, you have 0 people that are your users, right? And there's two situations that usually happen. Either major media outlet that has 50 million viewers launches your thing for you and says, hey, get on here. And then everyone swarms onto it. And wow, you have a successful platform because you had some kind of partnership that drove people there. That's one thing that can happen. And the other is that it dies. And it dies more quickly than you could possibly, and it breaks your heart because you put all this energy into it and you didn't have a good way to solve the problem. And the dying thing is more common, right? So, and the other problem with this is that people's attention is fragmented, right? Right. So I've already got like all these different social media platforms. What the heck? How am I supposed to do another one? So, so I completely agree with the criticism. The not Reddit thing is mostly the chaplains saying that, and that's from their perspective of seeing what it is, right? I actually created a subreddit called Spiritual Care that has exactly 1 member right now. I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do I kind of spin something up, right, with this thing? Because I think that there is real value in having a presence on these platforms in terms of the driving awareness and getting people there and whatnot. Absolutely, there's value in that. Is it ideal? No, right? But if we think about long range, right? Maybe we start something on Reddit and maybe we start to evolve our public consciousness, right? The fact that that platform doesn't exist today doesn't mean that it won't in the future. I actually, I'm hoping, I'm trying to figure out where to find this funding, but I'm still talking to CaringBridge. CaringBridge has 25,000 caregivers that are using it like almost every day. And if I could build a new section on this nonprofit website, then that's a great way to have a built-in community that can kind of filter over and potentially outgrow the initial function. But there's a seed, right? There's a seed of people that are the right people who need this type of care that can filter in there. So there's partnerships. I think there's a lot we can do through partnerships and through affiliations that would get the people in the room that need to be there. I don't, having a standalone platform that was only an online spiritual care community, that was the only thing it did, I don't see that working. But I do think that having it be something else that's put into existing systems that meet the real need is a more effective way to think about solving that. Great question. Did I see one more up here?
Okay, so the spiritual care is not the first thing that popped in my head when I think about research.
Totally.
I was just wondering how you started.
Sure.
How this became your
Sure. Yeah. Okay, I'll tell the personal story since you asked. When I was, I've had a very windy road. My first degree was in creative writing. I was an English major. I went to the Bay Area and I started working in content marketing. And I did that for 3 years. And I found out that I didn't want to work in the Bay Area. I actually got fired from my first job after reporting someone for sexual harassment. I got fired. I turned in a coworker and I got fired. And I was like, what the hell? So that was when I learned what the Bay Area is all about. Warning. Watch out, people, and be good people. Please be good people. But I just didn't want to stay there anymore. And I came back and got a neuroscience degree. And I was like, okay, the neuroscience degree was just how far away can I possibly get from software and technology and all this stuff. And at the end of that, I did that very quickly. It was a year and a half because I already had the prerequisites from my first degree. And at the end of that, I was kind of like, the Bay Area sucks, but they also are running the show. And like, if I just run away from it, knowing what I know now, then like, I'm not fulfilling my purpose really. Like, so I kind of decided that I was going to get back into tech. I was going to get a computer science PhD because I wanted to challenge the dominant perspectives that I was seeing. And right as I made that decision, my mom got sick with cancer and died 3 months later. It was literally the last semester of the neuroscience degree. It was very sudden. It was very rare. There was nothing anyone could do, right? There was no medication. So she died in 3 months. She had a CaringBridge site. And I actually didn't know about that until after she died because no one told me. And then I found it because I knew what CaringBridge was, and I was like, I wonder if she had one. And I Googled it and I found it, and I was like, oh my God, I read the whole thing. So my mom was super religious. She was very dogmatic Catholic, and I had a very strong reaction to Catholicism. I would say I'm completely on the other end of the spectrum now, personally. Again, not to say anything bad about religion. My own personal experience with it was very negative, and it was a really big problem in my relationship with her. But when I read her CaringBridge site, it was all of her church friends, and they were all praying for her, and it was like this cute. And I didn't. The prayer part didn't resonate with me, but the fact that she was surrounded by love did. I could see that she was completely surrounded by people that loved her, and that they were showing their love for her in the way that they knew how. So, so my first week of the first couple months of my PhD program, I wasn't even looking at CaringBridge. I wanted to look at misinformation. That was my initial research topic that I was interested in. And I did write a couple papers on that topic, but what happened was it was maybe the second month of my program, somebody just made an announcement like, oh, over the course of the last year, we've been developing this partnership with this local nonprofit called CaringBridge. Is anybody interested in doing research with CaringBridge? And I was like, what? It just felt like, because I remembered back to my experience, and I was like, okay, I'm going to do a side project. So I did a side project, and then I did another side project, and then my dissertation was all about it. It just kind of went that direction. And this prayer result that I showed you, right? There's a ton of research in HCI that is looking at social support, quote unquote. There's a lot of it. Like there's a critical mass of that. People have figured out that people go online to seek support a long time ago, 20 years ago, right? And there's been a lot of research about that. But when I was doing this study, the one that I showed you guys on the slides, there were no prior studies that mentioned prayer. Actually, that's not true. There was like one or two, but they had them listed as like a subcategory of emotional support. And when I was reading the data, like literally reading people's journals, I was like, these are not the same thing. And I think it's a scientific. They're like, oh yes, prayer. It's like a form of emotional support, right? It kind of is. I kind of see what they were going for. But when I was reading that data, I was like, and I knew my mom. And I was like, prayer and emotional support are not the same thing for my mother. I guarantee you that, So I was like, I'm going to split these into different categories. And if it turns out that the prayer thing is really small, I can always merge them back together and do it the way everybody else has done it. But then it turned out that prayer just blasted everything else out of the water. So it was actually me being a good scientist and me being closer to the data and honoring what the data actually looked like that drove that result to happen. And after I saw that result, again, not motivated by my own religious anything, right? It was just, this is what the data looked like. I saw that result and I was like, damn, nobody is studying this. So I decided to do that follow-up study looking at spiritual support because it was an intuition. It's one of those moments you can't completely pinpoint. I didn't actually even know about spiritual care as a discipline at that point. I started meeting chaplains during that second study when I was trying to figure out what the definition of spiritual support was. That's when I learned what chaplains were and who they were and how they operated. And, it kind of is all history from there, right? And I figured out that field hadn't had any technology. And I was like, oh, cool. This is a research opportunity now because, it's original, it's novel, right? And I hopefully can get funding for that. So Templeton funded my first study, and now we're in a little different funding environment. I'm a little scared, but that's another story. There's the full story, right? It was definitely a combination of experiences that were some of the most profound and painful experiences in my own life that drove the interest in the topic, along with just being a good scientist and looking at the data and this is what is needed. And now that I can't unsee what I've seen, I'm like, I know that this is what the world needs, right? How many, there's plenty of times when people will you have a friend and they're just trying to fix your problem. They just want to fix your problem. And that makes you shut down. I don't want to be fixed. I just want you to be here. And everyone's like, go get a therapist, go get a therapist, go get a therapist. It's like, maybe you do need a therapist. Maybe you do need a therapist. Maybe your chemicals are off and you just need to go get some medication. That is totally possible. But there's also situations where it's you don't need a therapist. You need a community. You need belonging. You need someone to sit there and be present with you. And no one in your life is because they're all so distracted. So some of it is like, some of what I think is like, getting professional spiritual care providers more into public dialogue, more into public consciousness is one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is like teaching everyone basic spiritual care skills. Everyone needs these skills, and we are not being taught these things. Just acceptance, like, don't get me started. Well, you kind of already, you invited me here.
Just putting you a little bit on the spot.
Sure.
I guess going on the like, so if you said like, so the world needs like food, but it cannot be fed by organic farms.
That's true.
Alone. So we need something that is like inherently evil to solve the problem.
Okay.
Do you see? I mean, is there like, do you envision a way that you would not need something like Reddit or is inherently evil to like convey these words?
Yeah.
Is there like?
Yeah. Okay. So I don't think that Reddit is inherently evil. That's my first. I literally sat down in a room for an hour and had a direct one-on-one conversation with the CEO of Reddit. I don't think that he's evil. I would probably go work for Reddit if academia goes under and we can't survive because we're being dismantled systematically by the federal government. Reddit would actually be up there on my list of companies that I would consider working at, because it actually has great mechanics that can work. The problem is that emergent, sociological phenomenon kind of just take over, and we don't have enough guardrails on the system. And the other thing I'll say about Reddit is it's like the typical response, like in a lot of these subreddit communities. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways. I'm going to get off on such a tangent. There's a lot of different ways that we moderate, right? If we have something like, there's this really famous example a couple of years ago of a racist community that I won't, talk too much about because it's significantly offensive. But the platform Reddit decided to ban the entire subreddit. That was the solution. It's like, this is a racist space and we don't want this on our platform. So we're just going to delete the whole community and they're not allowed to be here anymore. Some people studied that to find out, was that an effective moderation action, or did people just take their hate to different subreddits, right? Turns out some people did, but actually it reduced on whole the amount of hateful stuff that was coming out of that. So that's one solution. Other solutions are more typical, like in a community, like someone's being a jerk, someone's being racist or sexist, or you ban them. Why is that person attacking other people? Because they're hurting. They are not getting their needs met. And we are further ostracizing them. Instead of saying something like, I'm not saying that they should still be allowed to interact in the space, but how do we take those people and help them so that they stop hurting other people, right? Because if we systematically just keep banning people, they get further and further and further and further estranged instead of remediated. So imagine what the world looks like if we have better tools for kind of helping people to heal than just saying that banning them. I mean, banning them is effective, right? In some ways, right? And this is kind of, we're working some very controversial territory here, right? And I recognize that, but everyone needs to heal. So other things like training, like you could if you had more training and more guardrails before people were allowed to start interacting, that slows down your user acquisition because it's friction, but maybe improves the quality of community. So I think there's things that can be done in existing spaces that would improve. But yeah, it's not perfect. But okay, I've got like 3 hands up. Why don't you go? Go ahead.
The kind of spiritual care that you're talking about that the participants in your study have experienced with seems like very individualized, very
Yes.
one-on-one.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like what we're talking, and like in that case, it's like, okay, trying to provide spiritual care feels kind of like swimming upstream
Sure.
against a spiritually sick society,
Yes.
right? And like very powerful social forces
Yeah.
working in the other direction.
Yep.
And it sounds like what you're talking about is, can we scale up this highly individualized care
Yes.
online? But is there, I guess, is there sort of a less individualized social component that needs to change so that you're not, swimming upstream?
This is a beautiful question, and I love it so much. And yes, so I agree with you that the one-on-one model of things doesn't scale, right? That actually doesn't solve the problem, right? The fact of it being online is nice because it makes it more accessible, but it doesn't scale. The piece where this starts to scale is when we have a chaplain as a moderator, and the chaplain is moderating a community of 1,000 people, and all those 1,000 people are, they've all been through some kind of acculturation process. They've learned some skills along the way. They're not in-depth trained professionals, but they're pretty good at doing some of the things that the chaplain might have offered. And we saved the chaplain for the real crisis cases. So we've done follow-up work. So one of the studies that I didn't present on was we did a survey of over 1,000 spiritual care stakeholders to ask questions about like the community format. Should it be one-on-one? Should it be a group thing? Should it be public? Should it be private? Should it be anonymous? Should it be identified? These very high-level design questions. It turns out that a Reddit-like space wins, where it's anonymous, public, and asynchronous. A Reddit-like kind of community seems to be the right approach. But the other piece of this, when we did another set of methods, co-design workshops, right, with chaplains, where we're like, okay, so we took the results from the first couple of studies and showed them these results. And we're like, okay, now let's think about interfaces, right? Let's actually prototype some interfaces for these things. What it turns out is that all these chaplains will be like, yes, we need the big open public space because that's like a congregation. We need also to have these spaces where people are actually seen for who they are, because that's profound. That is what spiritual care is seeing someone, witnessing someone, being with them, not a synonymous user handle, right? And you have to have both of these things actually to be able to really fully meet the need. And so what we've kind of come up with now, and what we're thinking about, and I'm talking to CaringBridge about this. If you know of any funders that want to fund this work, please, like we're trying to be strategic and figure. I'm thinking about actually trying to do crowdfunding because I think that might be kind of interesting for this. But what we're thinking about doing is having an interface where people show up and they're initially in a kind of synchronous situation with, say, 3 to 5 other users who are online that are not professionally trained chaplains, and they have a synchronous interaction, whether that's text or video based. And then after that, they have the interaction. The conversation or the transcript can get posted to the community, so that if they consent to it, so that others can benefit from this kind of congregational feel. They can go look at the transcripts or the conversations that happened in other small group circles. And over time we accrue, right, this kind of congregational feeling where people can be anonymous in that space, but seen in the small space. That mode of support, we think our evidence that we've gathered from chaplains so far seems like it might be able to kind of scratch some of these itches in a way that does scale potentially. And you have the moderators there. So if you need to involve a moderator, you can, right? And sometimes the moderators will get involved. You do have the professional interacting in the small space or in the one-on-one space or whatever it takes, right? But they're not the only source of support, right? Other people become more skilled. And my grand hypothesis is that if we do this online, then people are going to do it offline too. Because people do learn things online that they do offline.
Okay, well, let's thank the speaker. There are more questions.
Stick around for a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you all. Appreciate it.